May I proceed? Sometimes, when bad things happen, our emotions take over. We get this urge, this need, to find somebody to blame. But today, I'm going to ask you to take a step back, to walk through with me each step of that dive on July 7th. And as we go through what happened, piece by piece, I want you to ask yourself the same question, over and over again. Should Neptune have known that this was going to happen? And now this question is important because today Neptune is being charged with recklessness. And what that means is that the three people sitting at this table have to prove to you two things, more likely than not. First, that the decisions that Neptune made on July 7th created an unreasonable degree of risk. And second, and most importantly, that Neptune should have known that those risks would likely cause Lee Allen to die. But if you listen today, you'll see that had things gone the way Neptune had planned, Mr. Allen would likely still be with us today. Members of the jury, today you will learn about 3 unforeseen circumstances that took an ordinary dive and turned it into a disaster. And you'll see that had these unforeseen circumstances not happened, Mr. Allen wouldn't have passed away. First, you're going to hear about a storm. A storm so powerful that it forced not just Lee Allen, but other divers off their scheduled path. A storm that made the water so fast that it was difficult to even move. But you'll see that Neptune had no idea that this storm was coming. You'll see that the weather report that Neptune checked showed only a bit of wind. Dr. Jordan Nelson, an expert in marine physics, will tell you that despite the fact that the weather report came from a reliable source, it was completely wrong. Dr. Nelson will tell you that the storm that Lee Allen dove in was exponentially stronger than anything that anyone predicted. And that no one, not even the world's best weather reporting service, saw it coming. Next, you're going to hear about something called nitrogen narcosis. Dr. Quincy Montgomery, an expert in scuba diving medicine, will tell you that divers who suffer from nitrogen narcosis can experience confusion, dizziness, even lightheadedness. And that's why Neptune requires a certain amount of experience from its divers. Dr. Montgomery will tell you that divers with more experience are better able to recognize their symptoms and respond appropriately. But you'll learn today that Mr. Allen wasn't honest about the amount of experience that he had. So when he suffered from narcosis on July 7th, he didn't respond appropriately. And you'll see today that Neptune couldn't have known that this was going to happen, because when Mr. Allen told them that he did have the necessary experience, there was no reason for them to believe that he was wrong. Finally, you'll hear today about a knife. A knife that no one saw coming. You'll hear today that Mr. Allen's nitrogen narcosis made him aggressive and frantic. Reggie Rogers, Neptune's dive leader, will tell you that when she tried to save Mr. Allen, he swung a knife at her. She'll tell you that in that moment, she had to make a choice. And though that choice wasn't easy, she knew that to save herself, she had to let go of Lee. Members of the jury, this case was a tragedy. This case is about unforeseeable circumstances.
Mr. Fernandez, am I saying that right? Fernandez?
Yes, that is correct.
Mr. Fernandez, you spoke with the Allens about their dive experience prior to their diving on this expedition, right?
Yes, I did.
They both told you they had done 50 dives.
That's right, that is what they said.
Now to you, it did not seem like Lee Allen's dive experience matched her diving performance underwater.
That's right. Lee Allen was talking a lot about how great he was underwater, but that is not what I saw.
Lee Allen was struggling on the dives prior to July 7th, correct?
From what I could see, yes.
And these dives are what you would consider warm-ups.
Yes, they were in shallower water, so they were a bit easier than the deepest Hepburn dive.
Underwater, you saw that she was giving incorrect hand signals.
Yes.
And that she was lagging behind the entire group.
Correct.
And to you, it seemed that every time she resurfaced, she was dizzy and disoriented.
Yes, from what I could see, that is what I could tell.
Now, Reggie Rogers of Neptune, he asked Mr. Allen, if he was okay.
That's right.
And Mr. Allen said that he was.
Right, he said never better.
Now, I want to talk to you about Neptune. You think that the crew aboard that ship was great.
Oh yes, they were phenomenal.
You'd say they were as good as you've ever seen.
Oh yes.
They gave clear instructions.
That is correct, yeah.
And they knew how to communicate well underwater.
Oh, of course.
Now, prior to the dive on July 7th, they gave you and the rest of the divers some instructions. Is that correct?
That's right. We were given instructions.
They laid out a dive plan.
That's right.
And they told you that this dive was limited to the upper deck of the Hepburn.
That's right. We were only to go to the upper deck that day. The next dive, which would be a Friday, we were to go to the second deck.
Now, Lee Allen asked the question, right?
Right. He asked if he could go down to the second deck.
Reggie Rogers said no.
That's right.
Now, this wasn't the first time that Lee Allen had asked to go down to the second deck, is that correct?
No, he had asked 3 times that day.
And as far as you know, Reggie Rogers said no at each of those times.
That's right.
Now, I want to talk to you about your presence here in court today. You were contacted by Miss Allen a couple of days after the incident.
Yes, I was.
And at first, you did not want to get involved.
No, I was working on a new painting. I really did not have the time.
You didn't want to come to court today.
That's right.
It was then that Miss Allen threatened you.
Yes, she did.
She said that it was your fault that her husband had died.
That's right.
And she said that if you did not come to court, she was going to sue you for all you were worth.
That's correct.
So it was after Miss Allen threatened you that you decided to come to court today.
Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Fernandez. No further questions at this time.
No redirect examination. May this witness be excused.
Yes, Mr. Yes.
Conclusions. I'm paid $10,000 for testifying today.
So combined, you're paid a total of $38,000. Is that true?
That's correct.
So you also reviewed 2 affidavits with that in mind. One of those was of Mr. Hathaway, and the other one was of Lee Allen, and Andy Allen, excuse me.
I reviewed 3 affidavits. I reviewed the affidavit of Hayden Hathaway and Andy Allen, as you mentioned, as well as the affidavit of Reggie Rogers.
Great. Now, for the moment, let's just focus on the first 2.
Of course.
So, in your opinion, was there an established amount of experience between Neptune and what Mr. Allen had?
Are you...
Objection, Your Honor. Improper opinion. If I may explain. Your Honor, I believe opposing counsel is talking about scuba diving experience. Dr. Tran is a medical doctor.
I need counsel to clarify our question. I didn't understand your question at all, actually.
Yes, Your Honor. So, according to Mr. Allen's affidavit, Mr. Hathaway never asked about his level of scuba diving experience. Is that true?
I'm confused. Could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. One more time. According to Mrs. Allen's affidavit, Mr. Hathaway never asked about Mr. Allen's medical conditions.
That's correct. Mrs. Allen wrote in her affidavit that Lee Allen's medical, or Andy Allen for that matter, medical history was never brought up, and Andy Allen didn't bring it up either.
Did you find that this was important when you were forming your conclusions about nitrogen narcosis?
I did. I thought the medical history should have been brought forward, and if I had consulted Neptune, I would have asked them to make physical exams a part of the signing up people for the dives.
But Mr. Hathaway's affidavit did mention that he asked for medical experience. Isn't that true?
That's exactly right. There's a discrepancy between the two.
And yet, Dr. Tran, you picked the affidavit of the person who's paying you. Isn't that true?
I decided to go with the person signing up for the dive. That's right.
Now let's move on to your analysis. I want to make a few things clear. You suffer from a condition known as hydrophobia. Isn't that true?
That's right. That means I'm afraid of water. So I study scuba diving, but I have never, probably will never go scuba diving.
So you've never experienced what it's like to breathe underwater?
No.
You've never experienced what it's like to breathe in an emergency situation underwater?
No, I avoid water at all costs. I just study it. I thought it would help, but I'm still afraid of water.
But you use the breathing gas calculations of Mr. Allen and Miss Rogers underwater.
I am able to calculate how one breathes underwater. I have never physically felt the things I've studied.
But when it came to Miss Rogers' calculation, it was a presumption, it wasn't natural measurement. Is that true?
I'm a bit confused.
When you said that Miss Rogers' emergency breathing rate of 50 liter bars underwater, that was her emergency breathing rate, that wasn't actually measured. Is that true?
I conducted some tests on Reggie Rogers' breathing under duress, but that was the duress of the actual situation of July 7th is not possible to be reenacted. I just measured his regular breathing rate underwater.
But again, you yourself have never been under duress underwater.
I've never been underwater, no.
So couldn't those calculations be incorrect considering that you don't know the actual condition they were conducted under?
I did not study Reggie Rogers' breathing under duress, just his breathing in general.
So again, Dr. Tran, could those calculations be incorrect?
Those calculations are not related to Reggie Rogers under duress.
So moving on with your underwater experience, you've also mentioned that the severity of nitrogen narcosis can affect one's experience underwater.
Absolutely, it impairs your judgment and your decision-making.
In fact, it can make divers feel unsafe.
It can make them feel unsafe and uneasy and act as though they normally would not. It's much similar to alcohol intoxication.
But Dr. Tran, you don't actually know the differences between the severities of nitrogen narcosis yourself.
Personal feelings? No. I've studied narcosis at length in my research.
And Dr. Tran, don't personal feelings change from diver to diver?
The effects of narcosis are different from diver to diver, especially with expert divers who can learn to cope with the onset of narcosis, whereas an inexperienced diver would very much be intoxicated.
And therefore, don't the feelings of safety in nitrogen narcosis also change from diver to diver?
I suppose nitrogen narcosis affects individuals differently, so the experience of safety would also be different.
So wouldn't you consider perhaps slowed swimming as a symptom of nitrogen narcosis?
That is often a symptom of nitrogen narcosis. Narcosis impairs physical mobility. Slowed movement is typical.
Wouldn't slight confusion also be a symptom of nitrogen narcosis?
Absolutely. When the nitrogen gets to the brain, it affects all of these physical movements and decision-makings.
Wouldn't an increased breathing rate also might be a symptom of nitrogen narcosis?
Absolutely.
But all those symptoms by themselves don't indicate the severity of narcosis.
Severity can be outlined by the different experiences, yes, but it doesn't outline the depth. I'm a bit confused.
What I'm asking is, just by observing those particular symptoms, you can't observe the severity of the narcosis.
That's right.
And also you can't observe how safe a person feels underwater.
That is a feeling of one's own. So, I suppose not.
So if it's a personal feeling, Dr. Tran, isn't it the person who's feeling it's responsibility to ascend?
I don't know about responsibility, but ascension is the treatment for narcosis. So one person, whether it be the person, him or herself, or suppose a dive leader, could instruct someone to ascend if they witnessed narcosis many times before.
But again, if it's a personal feeling, doesn't only that person know how safe they are?
Safety, I suppose, but when you witness impaired movement, vacant eyes, the thought, slowed movement, then that's narcosis. Those are telltale signs of narcosis.
But Dr. Tran, didn't you say that everyone experiences narcosis in different ways?
That's right. You can observe these differences by how they are acting.
And everyone feels different kinds of safety within their narcosis?
Objection, Your Honor. Ask and answer. By this point, opposing counsel has asked this question 3 different times.
So, Doctor, then how could an observer possibly understand such a personal feeling as narcosis?
Narcosis can be personal at shallow depths. When it's mild narcosis, it's euphoria. So if somebody could be gleeful, they could either be really happy or they could be experiencing narcosis. When narcosis becomes incredibly severe and someone has no longer the capability to move their own body, then that person no longer has control over the body to ascend on their own.
Thank you, Dr. Tran. No further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
No redirect examination, Your Honor. With the court's permission, may Dr. Tran be excused?
You may be excused.
May I proceed? Good afternoon, Ms. Allen. I understand that this must be incredibly difficult for you, so if you need a moment at any time, please let me know.
Sure.
I'd like to talk about a conversation that you and your husband had with Mr. Hathaway before you signed up for the expedition. During that conversation, Mr. Hathaway told you that the Hepburn dive was safe, didn't he?
Yes.
He told you that the Hepburn dive was safe as long as you had the proper amount of experience, isn't that right?
That's right. That's what he tell us.
Mr. Hathaway, he asked your husband if he had completed 50 dives, didn't he?
That's right. That's when Lee said we had, yes.
When your husband said that he had, that wasn't true, was it?
That's right. We had only done 45 times.
During that conversation, Miss Allen, you knew that you and your husband had only completed 45 dives, is that right?
Yes, I know.
During that conversation, Miss Allen, you knew that you and your husband hadn't gone below 90 feet before, isn't that right?
That's right.
During that conversation, you knew that your husband had been diagnosed with high blood pressure, isn't that right?
That is true, yes.
During that conversation, Miss Allen, you didn't tell Mr. Hathaway that you and your husband hadn't completed 50 dives, isn't that right?
Objection, Your Honor, relevant as to what Mrs. Allen did do, if I may explain. Pursuant to the orders on motion in limine ruled by the Honorable Judge Gilbertson, both parties in today's case are prohibited from discussing any reckless or supposedly reckless actions on the part of Andy Allen. Opposing counsel can certainly discuss what Lee Allen didn't tell Neptune underwater expeditions, but for them to ask Mrs. Allen about what she failed to mention to Neptune is barred under these orders.
May I respond?
Yes.
Your Honor, it's the defense's contention that some things that happened on that expedition were unforeseeable. If there are things that Miss Allen knew that she didn't tell Mr. Hathaway, there's no way for Mr. Hathaway to have known, and therefore made some events unforeseeable. That's what this line of questioning goes to.
Is the motion in limine?
Yes, Your Honor, it is. It's point number 3 on the orders in motion.
This says, while Andy Allen's actions may be probative with respect to other issues in the case, Andy Allen's actions are not imputed to Lee Allen. So, are we not okay if we hear what she did or didn't say, which would...
Your Honor, pursuant to that point, it said any allegation of assumption of risk or contributory recklessness on the part of Andy Allen is prohibited in today's trial. For them to use this information, Mrs. Allen failed to tell Neptune X or failed to tell Neptune Y is prohibited under Judge Gilbert's order.
Except that I don't think she's doing it to show, well, counsel, you speak to that.
Yes, Your Honor. This line of questioning isn't going toward an assumption of risk or a comparative fault. This line of questioning is going toward the foreseeability of things that happened on that dive.
Okay. And your precise question to Ms. Allen was what?
Was whether or not she knew that she and her husband hadn't completed 50 dives before.
If I may be heard, Your Honor?
No, you don't have to. I'm going to sustain the objection on that particular question. I misremembered what the question was. So that what she knew is only related to her assumption of the risk. The question is more, an issue could be raised about what Neptune knew and how it knew it. That's fair game, but not what she knew and what she kept back.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Allen, during that conversation with Mr. Hathaway, you didn't tell Mr. Hathaway that your husband had been suffering from high blood pressure, isn't that right?
No, of course not. He never asked us that. No.
During that conversation with Mr. Hathaway, you or your husband didn't tell Mr. Hathaway that you and your husband hadn't completed 50 dives, isn't that right?
No, like I say, he said we had done 50 dives. We had done 45.
Thank you, Ms. Allen. I'd like to move on now and talk about the dive itself. The first few dives were easier than the dive to the Hepburn shipwreck, isn't that right?
Yes, that's true. It's because they're higher in the water.
They were in open water as well.
Yes,
For you, those dives were easy, weren't they?
that's right.
Those dives, they didn't seem as easy for your husband.
That was always the case. That's right. I'm a better diver than me.
You noticed, Miss Allen, that your husband was having difficulties on some of the easier dives, isn't that right?
That is true. Yes.
You saw him clutching his chest.
Yes, at one point. Yes.
You noticed that his eyes were vacant.
Yes.
You noticed that your husband was swimming slower than some of the other divers in the group, isn't that right?
That's right. He was a slower swimmer.
But despite the fact that you saw your husband struggling on some of the easier dives, you didn't stop him from diving, did you?
No, I did not.
Despite the fact that you saw that your husband was struggling on some of the previous dives, as far as you know, he didn't say anything to Mr. Hathaway, did he?
As far as I know, no, he did not.
As far as you know, he didn't say anything about the fact that he was struggling to Miss Rogers.
No, Mr. Rogers was with us on the dives. She see everything. She know fully from the dives.
As far as you know, Miss Allen, your husband didn't say anything to a single employee at Neptune about the fact that he was struggling, did he?
No, most of them were underwater with us, watching him swim.
Now, Miss Allen, you're here in court today because you blame Neptune for your husband's death, isn't that right?
That's right, they are responsible for his death.
You think that this company did something wrong.
Yes, absolutely.
But Miss Allen, Neptune didn't force your husband to say that he had been on 50 dives when he hadn't, did they?
No, they don't force him to say that, no.
Neptune didn't force your husband to say that he had been below 90 feet before, did they?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. They force him to say it or not say it?
Neptune didn't force your husband to say that he had dove below 90 feet before.
Oh, no, they did not do that, no.
Those decisions were made by your husband, weren't they?
That's right, during our phone interview.
Miss Allen, the final decision to dive to the Hepburn shipwreck. That decision was made by your husband, not Neptune.
No, that's not true. There was a discussion about who was going to be his dive partner. He wasn't going to dive because I couldn't dive. Then Neptune paired him up with Reggie Rogers, dive leader, and they let him dive. That was their decision.
Miss Allen, is your testimony today that your husband did not want to dive to the Hepburn shipwreck?
Of course he wanted to dive. I'm saying they let him.
Is your testimony today that Neptune forced your husband to dive to the Hepburn shipwreck?
That is not what I said, no.
Thank you, Miss Allen. Your Honor, I have no further questions at this time.
Any redirect, Mr. Hart?
No, Your Honor, there is no redirect. With the court's permission, may Mrs. Allen be excused?
Good afternoon.
Would you please introduce yourself to the court?
Of course, my name is Dr. Jordan Nelson.
What do you do for a living, Dr. Nelson?
Well, I study and I teach marine physics.
I'm sorry, could you explain to everyone what marine physics is?
Oh, sorry, of course. Marine physics is the study of the ocean. But it's not the fish or anything that lives there like most people think. It's actually about the waves and the tides and the currents and the weather, how they all interact to create an incredibly complex system underneath the water. My personal interest is on how weather above the surface of the water can completely change the environments below.
Now, what qualifies you to be a marine physicist?
Well, I have my PhD in oceanography from the Scripps Institute, and right now I have the best job in the world, getting to teach to people all over the world at the University of Hong Kong and Boston University.
Now, Doctor, why are you in court today?
Well, on July 7th, 2011, Neptune Underwater Expeditions took a group of divers down to a shipwreck called the Hepburn. Unfortunately, one of the divers they took with them was lost, Mr. Lee Allen. So Neptune asked me to look at how the weather on the day of the event may have affected what happened under the water.
Now, did you come to a conclusion?
Yes, I did.
Did you have sufficient facts and data before coming to that conclusion?
Yes, I did. I had the opportunity to look at witness reports from people who were there on the day of the incident. I also looked at weather reports from the Koala Climate Institute, which is the gold standard for weather reporting service in the world. And I also got to visit the site and investigate it myself.
Now, did you apply these methods reliably?
Yes, absolutely.
And you used reasonable methods?
Yes, I did.
Now, what was your conclusion, Doctor?
Well, it was twofold. My conclusion was twofold, really. First, there was a storm that occurred on the day of the dive, and that storm was both deadly and it was completely unpredicted.
Let's take those two apart. You said that the storm was deadly. Why do you say that?
Well, it doesn't make sense to a lot of people, but storms above the water actually have a tremendous impact on the environments below. Storm cloud cover can make less light reach under the water, making it harder to see. Or it can make temperatures under the water incredibly cold. In this case, though, on the day of this dive, what happened was that the currents under the water sped up a dangerous amount.
Now, why is that important?
Well, simply put, fast currents makes it incredibly difficult to swim. The way I explain it to my students every semester is I take them right outside the lecture hall where there's a huge escalator, it's probably one of the tallest in the world, and I have them try and run up the down escalator. They make a little bit of progress, but the truth is, none of them ever make it. They just get tired and they get pushed down to the bottom of the escalator. The same thing happens underwater. If you're swimming in one direction and the currents are pushing against you in the other direction, you get tired out, you don't make any progress, you might even get flung around or pushed off course.
Now, Doctor, I want to talk to you about your second conclusion. And you said that this storm was unpredicted. What do you mean?
Well, what's important to remember is we have technology that's fairly good at guessing where a storm is going to be, but it can't guess when it's going to get there, or even how strong it's going to be when it gets there. And that's exactly what happened in this case.
So, can you describe to the jury why knowing when the storm would occur and how strong it would be is important in this case?
Well, I looked at a number of reports that described the storm. One was a prediction from the night before the storm, one was from the morning of, and one was an actual description of what happened on the day of the dive. All three of them reported radically different wind speeds, which create a variety of different scenarios that could have and did occur.
can you describe to the jury how these different wind speeds would have affected that dive?
Well, I can tell you, but I think it's a little easier if I can just show you. So I made a poster to help explain it.
That sounds great. Your Honor, at this time, may the witness step down and make use of a demonstrative.
Sure. Have the plaintiff's counsel seen the demonstrative?
I've seen the demonstrative, Your Honor.
Sorry, excuse me one second. Now, let's see. I want to make sure that.
You know what, Dr. Jordan, can you just prop it up on the board there so I can see it too? Otherwise my feelings will be.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out a place where you could see it as well. Just want to make sure. Sorry, on the board? Okay.
Yeah, just prop it up in that thing in front of the board. That way I'll see it, the jury will see it.
Can everyone see this? Can everyone over there?
Yeah, but you're gonna have to step to the other side or else I'm gonna get.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's great.
All right, cool. I spent time on this, so I really want to make sure everyone can see it.
Alrighty, Dr. Nelson, what's the first column?
So what this column describes is the weather report that Neptune Underwater Expeditions looked at the night before the dive. It said that there were going to be winds of approximately 22 miles per hour.
And how would 22-mile-per-hour winds affect the currents underwater?
Well, 22 mile per hour winds aren't actually that great. This picture shows what it would look like on the surface. At most, there are incredibly small waves. The effect on the ocean currents wouldn't go deeper than about 40 feet, and there wouldn't be any effect on the divers as they were descending. It would be too small to actually make a big difference.
Okay, Doctor, what does the second column refer to?
Well, this is the updated weather report from the morning of the dive. Neptune didn't see this report, but what this predicted was a storm with winds of 32 miles per hour.
And how would 32-mile-per-hour winds affect the currents underneath the water?
Well, the difference between these two isn't actually that big. It's a 32 mile per hour wind is what we call a fresh breeze. So you can see that there are slightly larger waves forming on the surface of the water. And it's possible that they would have expected a little bit of turbulence as they descended. However, once they got past 100 feet, there would be no effect whatsoever.
Okay, Doctor, and finally the third column. What does that refer to?
This is the storm that actually happened. It's something that nobody predicted. The storm winds ended up being 54 miles per hour, which was almost twice as fast as that updated prediction.
Now, you know what I'm going to ask. How do 54-mile-per-hour winds affect the currents underneath the water?
The difference is huge. All the way at 170 feet below the water, where the divers were, they were fighting currents of 2.5 miles per hour. That may not sound like a lot, but to put it into context, the absolute best swimmers in the world, unburdened at the top of the water, swim at about 5 miles per hour. Scuba divers have pounds of heavy equipment. They're suffering from incredible pressures that deep below the water, and it's just much harder to swim against it for them.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. Your Honor, may the witness retake his seat?
Sure.
Now, Doctor, when you looked at all of these reports and made your analyses, what was your ultimate conclusion?
Well, ultimately, as I said, this storm was deadly. It created currents that the best scuba divers couldn't fight against. And it was completely unpredicted. Koala Climate Institute, which is the gold standard, was unable to predict how terrifyingly massive the storm was going to be, and what a huge effect it would have under the water.
Thank you, Doctor. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Very well, just give me a minute. All right, cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor.
May I proceed?
You may.
Dr. Nelson, on direct examination, you told us that the storm that hit on July 7th was deadly.
Yes, that's correct. I think that evidence speaks for itself. Someone died in that storm.
It was devastating.
Yes, absolutely.
And in your professional opinion, you believe that this storm was unpredicted, right?
Absolutely. The storm that occurred was nothing like anything that anyone had predicted.
So what you're saying is that Neptune had no idea that this storm was coming, as severe as it actually happened.
Yes, that's correct.
But Dr. Nelson, that's not entirely true, no, is it?
I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean.
Isn't it true that on the weather forecast, that the defendant saw the night before the storm? At the very bottom of that forecast, it states, forecasts are always subject to change. Please check back for updates. That's what it says at the bottom of that report, right?
It's true. Like I said, our technology can't always predict when a storm's going to get somewhere, or how strong it's going to be. I do think that it's important to check back for weather reports frequently, especially shortly before a dive. The fact of the matter is, though, is even if they had, the report that they saw still would have predicted a storm. That was not a big deal at all.
Hold on a minute, Dr. Nelson. You said a lot there. First of all, direct me back to my question. That is what's written at the bottom of that report, right?
Yes, that is written there.
But the truth is, Neptune never went back to check for an update. Isn't that right?
They didn't see an updated report.
So they never went back and saw that updated report.
Yes, as I said, they did not see an updated report.
Now, Neptune checked the weather 12 hours before the dive was to take place, right?
Yes, they did.
And in your professional opinion, scuba diving companies should check the weather 3 hours before they're about to get in the water, right?
Yes, that's my personal opinion. I hold people to a slightly higher standard.
Dr. Nelson, that's your professional opinion, right?
Yes.
If the defendant had went and adhered to your standards, checked the weather 3 hours before the dive, they would have known that there was a thunderstorm coming when they were sending their customers into the water.
They would have known there was a storm coming with slightly stronger winds than had previously been predicted.
A thunderstorm, isn't that right?
No.
Is it your testimony that if Neptune had checked that weather report, they would not have seen that there was a thunderstorm coming? Is that your testimony?
The report says that there would have been a storm at the time of the dive. This is correct.
So they knew that there was a storm coming when they were going in the water, right?
They knew it was coming after the dive was scheduled to end.
Dr. Nelson, if the defendant had checked the weather even 7 hours before the dive was to take place, they would have seen that there was a storm coming when they're sending their customers into the water.
Yes, that's correct. A fairly mild storm, but yeah, they would be sending their customers into a storm.
Dr. Nelson, you keep saying that it was a mild storm. You wouldn't recommend sending scuba divers into the water even during that mild storm that you described, right?
It's true, I wouldn't.
Dr. Nelson, in your professional opinion, had Neptune seen that weather report, the only appropriate decision would have been to abort the dive. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct.
I want to talk to you about how that storm affected Lee Allen. You're aware that Lee Allen went into the water at 10 o'clock in the morning on July 7th, right?
Yes, that's correct.
That's when the group swam down to the wreck.
Yes, it is.
And when they were at the wreck, that's when the storm hit.
Yes, it is.
And as you mentioned on direct examination, that storm brought punishing winds, right?
Yes, it did.
That storm caused the visibility underwater to become poor.
Yes, that's correct.
That storm caused vicious ocean currents where the divers were. Isn't that right?
Yes, it did.
In your professional opinion, you believe that the storm caused or contributed to Lee Allen's death. Isn't that right?
Yes, I do.
But doctor, you'd agree with me in saying that that theory has a little bit of a flaw. Isn't that right?
Could you explain?
Doctor, 8 other customers went into the water that day, right?
Yes, that's correct. I believe what happened is that the currents caused by the storm caused one customer to get flung into the ship and get caught. As a result, the dive master of the dive at that time, I believe the name was Miss Rogers, sent Lee Allen ahead on his own.
Hold on a minute, Dr. Nelson. I know you're eager to answer my question, but I'd like you to keep your answer specifically to what I'm asking. Now, directing back to my question, there were 8 customers in the water that day, right?
Yes, there were.
Those 8 customers also experienced the same ocean currents that Mr. Allen did. Isn't that right?
Yes, they did.
Those same 8 customers faced the poor visibility that Mr. Allen did.
Yes, they did.
Those 8 customers came back to the surface alive. Isn't that right?
Yes, they did.
So Dr. Nelson, you'd agree with me in saying that if 8 other customers made it back up to the surface, then the storm can't be the only reason for Mr. Allen's death. Isn't that right?
No, but I do believe it played a significant factor. If the storm hadn't been there, I believe that Lee Allen would still be with us.
But it wasn't the only factor, right?
No.
Let's talk about what that other factor may have been. Now, you read the affidavit of Reggie Rogers, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Reggie Rogers is the defendant's diving instructor.
I believe he was the dive master on the dive.
So he's one of the instructors for Neptune.
Yes.
You know that at one point underwater, Reggie Rogers instructed Mr. Allen to swim alone.
Yes, I believe that was because he had to stay behind to help someone who had got caught in the ship because of the currents.
Dr. Nelson, Reggie Rogers sent Lee Allen into those strong currents by himself. Isn't that right?
That's my understanding.
Reggie Rogers sent Lee Allen alone where there was poor visibility.
That's my understanding, yes.
Reggie Rogers sent Lee Allen into a storm, similar to the storm that's pictured above. Isn't that right?
Objection, Your Honor, relevance.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yeah.
Today it's the plaintiff's contention that the defendant acted recklessly because they sent Mr. Allen alone into a shipwreck by himself. Now, just a moment ago, Dr. Nelson told us that the only reason for Mr. Allen's death couldn't have been the storm. We're exploring what that other possibility was. The fact is that they sent Mr. Allen alone into that wreck.
May I be heard?
Yeah.
Yes, Your Honor. This witness is an expert on ocean currents and how they affect divers underneath the water. He is not an expert on diving methods or strategies or how dive leaders or dive guides should treat their divers underneath the water when storms occur. Opposing counsel is asking the witness to make some conclusions about whether the decisions that were made underwater were good decisions. That is not his area of expertise.
I actually think the literal call of the question is, did Reggie Rogers, I guess, send Mr. Allen into a storm? Was that the question?
Yes, Your Honor. My question was if Reggie Rogers sent Mr. Allen into the storm similar to the one that's pictured above.
May I be heard?
Yeah.
Your Honor, that question is only relevant if it goes to prove what opposing counsel just said, that they're trying to show there was another reason for Mr. Allen's death. Otherwise, it's irrelevant.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I think it is, I think it's within his area of expertise, and I believe it's relevant. I think your objection would go to the
Dr. Nelson, Reggie Rogers sent Mr. Allen alone into a storm like the one that's pictured on the far right.
I believe the storm was already happening, but yes.
He sent Mr. Allen into a storm that you would describe as deadly.
Yes.
To your knowledge, Mr. Allen was the only customer that was sent alone.
As far as I know, yes.
And to your knowledge, Mr. Allen was the only customer that died that day.
As far as I know, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
redirect, Mr. Gonzalez?
No, Your Honor. At this time, we ask that the witness please be excused.
You may be excused, Dr. Nelson.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Just give me a minute.